It was pretty preconceived that I was going to go down one path because I was at Harvard and structural IO.
Ah,
Ariel Pekis was who was turned out to be my main advisor. Was
oh,
like,
okay.
I didn't have a choice at Harvard, right?
Yeah. Chris Nosko is a PhD economist, as well as vice president, head of science and analytics for Uber. He's my guest this week on the Mixtape with Scott, part of my ongoing series of talking to economists in tech. Chris did his PhD in economics at Harvard, focused on industrial organization, did a one-year stint at eBay postdoc, then went on to become an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. But he left. He's part of this more recent wave of PhD economists who left academia and went to the tech sector. And first went to Amazon, which is part of a common part of that broader story of the growth of the labor market for PhD economists in tech. And then more recently to Uber, where he's been for the last few years. In this interview, we talk about a lot of stuff, growing up in rural Oregon, falling into programming, a love of his liberal arts education at the University of Chicago, and as well as just a broad navigation of economics as a field, but also as a career, and his own just personality of being an intellectually curious person. This was a really delightful opportunity for me to learn more about Chris and get to know him a little better. I didn't know him beforehand, but I teach one of his papers with Blake, Nosko, and Tadalis, a 2015 article in Econometrica from that was born out of his time at eBay. So it was really nice to get to meet him and talk to him. But it was also neat to get a better idea of the broader trends in the market for PhD economists that's been happening in large mass really over the last 10 years or so in the tech industry. There was an earlier wave of more senior people, and he mentions this, people like Hal Varian and Susan Athey that kind of pioneered and went out into tech. But really the more recent has been the hiring of younger junior level PhD economists. And that's getting to hear Chris talk about that was really eye-opening. I think a lot of people are going to find Chris's story though really interesting, personally intriguing, may even see themselves or possibilities of their own life in Chris's own personal story, both his excitement and his intellectual curiosity for economics, as well as a possible life of what he calls doing science in tech, something that I don't think a lot of people think of as what an economist's job is in tech. Thank you again for coming and listening to this podcast. I'm Scott Cunningham, your host. Well, this is a real pleasure to introduce this week's guest on the podcast, Chris Nosko. Thanks so much for being here.
For sure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, well, before we get started, you could just say your name. I said your name, but your name, your title, and who it is that writes you your paychecks.
Yeah. Yeah. My name is Chris Nosko. I am a vice president of applied science at Uber now. So I lead the science team that works on most of Uber's core algorithms, both on the mobility side, which is rideshare, as most people know it, and delivery, which is getting food delivered to your house.
Okay, cool. All right, I can't wait to dive into this. Okay, well, so before we get into your career, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in rural Oregon.
Oh,
Small town about an hour west of Portland, as I like to say.
oh, cool. Hour
Yeah.
west. Oh, so that is Portland pretty close to the water already?
Portland's about an hour and a half to 2 hours. So I was on the way to the coast, but not all the way to the coast in Oregon.
Oh, wow. So did your family do vacations on the water?
Yeah, we would go. Yep, we went to the ocean quite often. Yeah, it was very much in our wheelhouse for sure.
Is it pretty cold up there when you get in the oceans that high? It's
It,
cold water, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say it depends on where you're coming from. Compared to Florida, it's really, really cold.
It's really cold.
Yeah, but you still go in the water. It's not so bad once you get used to it.
Yeah. Well, what kind of what were some of your favorite vacations that you had with your family as a kid? What's like What's a really memorable one that you still remember?
Yeah, we did a lot of, outdoor hiking, camping type stuff.
Uh,
So a lot of my memorable vacations with my family really involved camping in some way, shape, or form. That was
oh, okay.
a big part of our lives, I would say.
Just kind of in that area too, or did you ever go anywhere else?
Mainly in Oregon and Washington, pretty
Yeah,
simple stuff for the
yeah,
most part.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. What'd your mom and dad do for a living?
They both worked at the school that I grew up at. So my dad was an administrator, just retired, and my mom was a school teacher. She taught middle school there at the school.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah,
so they were both school teachers
yeah,
in
yep.
that smaller. It was a small town.
Yeah, very small. Yep, yep.
Wow.
Sheridan, Oregon, for those who know it or can look it up on Google.
Yeah. So I bet you had a really nice childhood. That kind of small town childhood, just like doing whatever.
Yeah, it had definitely pros and it had cons, or what seemed like cons to me at the time, but in retrospect were actually quite nice. So I'll explain that. Pros, of course, was like you say, small town, everybody knew everybody else, community, things along those lines.
Yeah.
Cons, especially if you're growing up, is we
Yeah.
were, a half an hour, 45 minutes to the movie theater,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Right. Oh,
was
so it
really
was that small. It was that
yeah,
small of a town.
yeah, very, very much. So,
Mm.
the sorts of conveniences that you get used to in a
Yeah.
lot of parts of the US, we just didn't really have. So,
Yeah.
again, like in retrospect, it's nice to have that rural trees, all that kind of stuff. It's beautiful. I love visiting back then. But
Yeah.
as a kid, all you want to do is go to McDonald's, man. And
Right.
McDonald's was not that easy to
You're
get.
like, all right, get in the car. We're gonna be gone for an hour. Go ahead and use
Yeah,
the bathroom.
yeah, exactly.
That's right. So um so did you graduate from high school in that town?
Yep, I did. Yeah.
Well, so what was the high school like? I guess it was smaller.
Yeah, I actually went to a private school outside of Sheridan, a very small school. My graduating class had 15 people in it, so
Mm,
extremely, extremely tiny. So very, very much, just small individualized attention, things along those lines.
okay. What were your interests? What were your kind of schooling interests and stuff?
Computers, I was really, really interested in computers all the way through high school. I did a lot of programming. I played a lot of sports as well. So between computers and sports, those were my two things, man. Spent most of my time doing those two things.
Well, what were you doing on the computer? You were doing like website design or something else?
Yeah, I learned to program Pascal, Basic, C back in those days,
Mm,
and just was really engaged. That was very much a time of tinkering with things. Learned to build my own computers, things along those lines. I think a lot of nerdy type people at that age go through that kind of phase, and I
yeah.
went through hardcore. Yeah, and
Yeah.
then I went through and started web design as well along those lines. But I'm a terrible graphic designer.
Right.
So at the end of the day, those were back in the days when you were doing the whole thing on your
Yeah.
own, and you realize very quickly that if you're not good at graphic design, your web page
Yeah,
is not.
that's right. They were really bundled. It's like right when the that kind of age of programming, it was like I always felt that too. It's like, well, yeah, this is great, but I don't know how to make anything pretty.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think over time, it's of course web development and just development in general. It's like bifurcated in many ways. So you can be
Yeah.
hardcore nerd or you can be graphic designer. But
Right.
back then, everything was still kind of like, as you say, bundled together a little
Well,
bit.
so
So
what kind of stuff were you making? You were making websites or blogs or what were you doing?
yeah, I mean, so actually, that just kind of actually furthers my development, like career a little bit. Actually, after I graduated from high school, I didn't go directly to college. I was actually working doing web development, and moved up to Seattle for a year
Oh,
after
wow.
after high school and before undergrad. And so then I was doing like web development type stuff, and that's actually part of when I really got into like some of the more hardcore type stuff. This is like
Mm.
I mean, I'm hardcore-ish, right? Like this is more like Microsoft Active Server pages and like, some of the C infrastructure that went into it, things along those lines.
How'd
So
you get that gig? What were you, how'd you even, so you like, you were a high school graduate, but that was like a real job.
yeah, I was working 40 hours a week, real, full-time job, things along those lines. And so this was in the late 90s. And if you rewind to the late 90s, you'll remember that there was just like this
Yeah.
huge desperate need for programmers, right?
Right.
And,
Right.
and actually, it's really interesting because programming is one of those things where it's really like a great equalizer in some ways because you can demonstrate, right? Like it's not one of those things where it's just about like, oh, what education do you have, et cetera. It's like, yeah, you get up to the board and you write some fucking code. So I don't know if I can drop the F bomb in this, but
You
like,
can drop that phone here.
yeah, and or like they ask for like samples of your work, things along those lines. So it's very
Yeah.
meritocratic in that sense, and
Right.
like that was a great time to be doing this sort of stuff. And then of course the dot-com boom hit, all that kind of stuff, and
Yeah.
things moved in a different direction. But yeah, the late 90s were in some ways, I think, a golden era in many ways, but especially for people that had programming skills and not a lot of like formal education.
Yeah. Yeah. So you decide not to stay. That was it. You decided then you're like, I'm ready to go to college.
Yeah, one of the best and most consequential things for me in life was realizing that early on that it's really important to go to college, or it was really important for me to go to college, right?
Yeah.
Because I had always had this vision of, why go to college? Why spend 4 years, et cetera. But then once you get into the day to day and you're able to look at people ahead of you and what they were doing, et
Yeah.
cetera, that's how I felt about it. I quickly realized I was like, this just isn't, there's got to be more to it than this. And that kind of pushes you, or at least definitely pushed me to college.
So how long were you up there doing
Three
that?
years, three
You were
years.
up there 3 years.
Total 3 years between when I graduated from undergrad. Sorry, when I graduated from high school and when I started in undergrad. So
Yeah, you were. There was a 3 year gap
yeah,
between high school and college.
exactly right. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
when you decided to go to college, where'd you what were you like? What was you probably went with like some real fortitude, like I have a plan. Is that right?
Yeah, I applied to one and only one school, which was the University of Chicago, and I applied, early decision. I got in early decision, and just went with it. So I really had a pretty clear conception of what I wanted to do. Of course, it turns out that that was just all hubris, and of course I
Yeah.
should have applied to many more schools. And if
Right.
I had given myself more of a latitude to think of, maybe I would have applied to different types of schools, things like that. I didn't have any knowledge of that at all,
Yeah.
and so I was really attracted to a lot about what the U of C offered, and so I just went with it. It was great.
What
It turned out to be a great decision for me, but of course, very narrow in retrospect. I wouldn't
well,
advise
so what were you think what did you even know about Chicago as a young person like that?
two things. One was, I love the idea of a liberal arts education, and
Yeah.
Chicago, right? Like sort of this strong core curriculum and this idea of the great books, things along those lines. So very attractive
Mm.
to me at the time. And the second thing, which we'll again hopefully end up spending a lot of time talking about, was the economics program. And I had always been interested in economics. Sort of dabbled around in some sense. I had,
Hmm.
like, didn't really know what an economist did. I mean, who understands what an economist does when
Yeah.
you're like high school, right? It's
Right.
kind of a weird unknown thing.
Yeah.
I just love the idea of what I knew about economics. And
Hmm.
so the combination of obviously the history that Chicago has with econ
Hmm.
and the combination of the liberal arts education kind of pushed me in that direction. And then frankly, I just went and visited and I loved it, fell in
I
love with it.
bet. Wait, so when did you first start? When did you first start having any interaction with economics? Before I even ask about Chicago, what about, was it in high school or what was it?
Yeah, it was in high school, around some of this idea of like classical liberal
Yeah.
philosophy, right? Which also kind of pushed me into like Chicago as well,
Right.
like sort of
Yeah.
like the Milton Friedman, Hayek type stuff, right?
Hmm.
Which I think is of course, an infatuation of many, many high school kids, right?
Yeah.
And it, a little bit for me as well, along, the cleanliness of free markets, things
Right.
along those lines, right?
Yep.
Then while I was working, I took a couple of community college classes on economics and kind of learned much more about the nitty gritty of like supply demand curves and shifting demand curves and moving along demand curves, kind of
Hmm.
everything I learned in like, micro 101. And I just really liked that. So those are the two areas that I had kind of already started to think a little bit about.
Yeah.
Of course, then you get to college and grad school and you realize, well, it's totally different than that. But at the end of the day, that excitement around economics really, I think, built with
Yeah,
those two
it
things.
always is also kind of has always felt like Chicago and that kind of classical liberal tradition in general has more inroads in the tech industry for some reason. I don't know if I'm even viewing that right, but I would think even back then it seemed like, is that accurate?
I mean, I don't have I've never done like a professional survey
Yeah.
or anything along those lines. But I think that's probably true that there's very much a theme that carries through both of those things, right?
Hmm.
Um, I don't have any great theories of pulling those
But you
together.
would have like, but you're up there programming and being a part of that community. You were only having that in like kind of reinforced a little bit around you, that interest in Chicago.
I think that's right. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, right.
makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense.
I mean, both economics, at least in the classical liberal sense, and programming have a very, to me, they have a very like clean view on things, right? Like if only you could figure out what
Right.
the algorithm is and break it into like subcomponents in a very neat and clean way.
Yeah.
And so it kind of appeals, I think both of those things probably appeal to a certain like logical structure
Right.
in certain people's brains. And so they end up kind of pulling together,
Well, so what happens at Chicago? Tell me what did you think your first year was going to be like, and what was it like?
Um, I loved it. My first and my second years were probably my favorites, mainly for reasons that we were just talking about, which is it exposed me to a whole new set of things, around the great books that I, just were like kind of blew my mind and kind of like
Mm,
changed my whole perspective on life in many ways, right?
wow.
I really had nothing to do with economics at that time. I was taking econ classes, and there was sort of like a separate thread that we could talk about my transition there. But actually, my econ classes were definitely not the most exciting part of my first and second years at college. I mean, it's sort of like micro econ at U Chicago is about doing a lot of calculus, right? It's about taking a
Right.
lot of derivatives, and like that's not you kind of the content and the deep economics
Yeah.
didn't really come out until much later, I would say,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they're
Yeah. Yeah.
eating your vegetables in that sense for
Right.
first and second year and micro and then macro.
Hmm.
But the world of ideas that came from a lot of the sort of stuff we were reading around political philosophy and
Mm,
going all the way back to like just the Hume and people like that were just really influential for
mm.
me.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you get a major in economics, or do you get like this kind of broader great books kind of major?
Oh, the first 2 years are pretty much all just liberal arts type stuff
Hmm.
with you like of your core curriculum majors, and then your third and fourth year end up being pretty much all your major, right? So
Oh,
yes, the answer is you do. I ended up with a major in economics,
yeah.
but you just tilt more towards kind of some of the great book stuff, liberal
Yeah.
arts, the first two
Well, so
years.
which professors as an undergrad at Chicago really made an impression on you?
I didn't really have a ton of like those inspirational professors that I can speak to.
Mm,
Um, I never had that moment with a professor, to be really honest. I was really engaged with the material, but
yeah.
I think material more than anything spoke for itself rather than like some professor that I really
Wait,
latched
so
on.
is that like you're there as an undergrad before Levitt wrote Freakonomics?
Oh, way
Because
before. Yeah, this is way
way
before.
before.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe not way before. I was an undergrad from 1999 to 2003. I think
Oh
Freakonomics was
yeah,
like
because I think that's like more mid, right? Like 2005
2005,
or six or something.
2006. Yeah, yeah. Like
Oh,
Jim Heckman had just won the Nobel Prize, and so there
oh
was a
yeah.
on campus for Jim Heckman, right? Things along those lines.
Mm,
So that was kind of where we were at I guess as the Chicago was at as an economics department was much more in the Heckman stuff pre Levitt kind of
mm.
became really popular with economics.
Well, what did you think about Becker's stuff when you were an undergrad? Because that's like it's funny. Like Becker's not really the celebrity amongst the classical lib. Like he's not the gateway drug. The way that classical liberalism is for people that get into econ.
Yeah, yeah.
Not
Friedman.
always. He was for me, but not for everybody.
Oh, Becker was for you. I'm curious.
Yeah,
Why did
I read his Nobel Prize speech. Kind of more of a liberal arts. I was an English major and
there you go. Yeah.
got a job doing market research, qualitative research, and ended up trying to teach myself a bunch of qualitative methodology. So that kind of takes you into like reading sociology and stuff. But
Oh
I ended
yeah.
up at the John M. Olin working paper series at Chicago for some reason and was just reading kind of, like when you're on the internet, you're just like
Yeah.
following these weird trails. And so
Yeah.
I was deep in that stuff. And but I was really into economics too for the classical liberal stuff. If you're into economics for the classical liberal stuff, then you'll read a lot of the Chicago people, but they're like in some ways not nearly as classical liberal because they're like robust mainstream economics. It's like so much, even though it's got that long history, it's not like George Mason or the Austrian or
Right,
something,
right, right. Yeah.
And so I kind of quit noticing it that I was like I didn't notice where I was as much. And then I ended up reading Becker's Nobel Prize speech after reading a bunch of law and econ. And I just was like, I just remember thinking, well, I don't think I'll ever be happy if I'm not an economist.
Oh,
So
there you go. I mean, that's inspiring right there.
yeah, it was pretty great. It was
Yeah.
pretty great. I mean, I love, Yeah, you and I actually have really similar interests. I mean, and I do want to get into it, but like, so then you graduate and do you immediately say, I want to become an economist?
No, at the time was still trying to figure out myself a little bit and what I wanted to do. And I actually hadn't. This is maybe a lesson for people that are listening and interested in econ grad school. I actually hadn't done some of or a lot of the stuff that you're quote unquote supposed to do to get into a good econ program when I was an
Mm.
undergrad, right? Like real analysis, things along the hardcore math. I didn't do that, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so in some ways, really I wasn't quite qualified to go to like a really good econ PhD program. So what I ended up doing was I was also very interested in the idea of potentially becoming a lawyer, which would
Yeah.
have been a terrible mistake. So I'm
Yep.
glad that I was able to,
I did
but
that too.
oh yeah,
Yeah,
you
that's right.
with the idea or you became a lawyer.
Some guy told me, he said, you'd probably like being a law student more than a lawyer. And I was like,
Exactly.
I don't know exactly what that means, but I kind of know exactly what that means.
Yeah, I don't know what that means, but it sounds bad, right?
It sounds like 3 years that I would like, and then stuff
Yeah.
followed that I wouldn't like. Yeah, keep going. Sorry.
So I took a job at an economics consulting company where I felt like I could learn a little bit more about like what it was like to do economics in the real world, as well as get exposure to the legal world and to lawyers, which is
Yeah.
when I determined that I really wouldn't want to be a lawyer, right? Because I could feel
Mhm.
like you see a lot of lawyers and you're like, hey, there's some people doing this cool economic stuff. And then there's some people that really hate their lives. And I know which of the two of those camps that I was.
It's yeah, exactly. Right.
Um,
Where'd you end up going doing the consulting? Was that like Lexicon or something like that?
It was Nira. I worked at Nira,
Oh,
Economics
okay. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. Okay.
Research Associates, Nira. Yeah. So after a year of doing that, I was kind of like, look, I want to do this econ thing. I know I'm not. I'm just not ready for that. So I took a job as a research assistant for Harvard professor David Leibson.
Oh,
He had this. David is great. I love David. David is very inspiring as an economist and was a wonderful person to work for. So he had a little crew of people working at the National Bureau of Economic Research (NBER), right, in Cambridge.
oh, so
And
this is prior to going to Harvard. You get a
yeah,
gig as an RA at the NBR for Leibson. What year is this?
2004, 2005, maybe.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So this is it's a wonderful, wonderful way to expose yourself to what it's like to do in econ research, just to be a research assistant for a professor. And so that was a great experience for me. And of course, the deal was, like you do really good work, and David, writes a really good recommendation letter for you, and that's kind of like explicitly why you're in it, and he knows that, and everybody knows it, and
Hmm.
so that was my path to Harvard. Actually, was not through the normal channel of like real analysis, like things along those lines. It was working as a research assistant and kind of building David's trust over that year, and then he helped me get into Harvard. So
But that's weird. That's the new model also, is the pre-doc RA position,
yeah, and
you
that's
know? So
yeah,
probably that's like an early version of it.
yeah, exactly. It was very less formalized, not as
Right.
formalized as it is now,
Mm.
but yeah, definitely wasn't early.
What do you think made him notice you to give you that opportunity?
You mean why did he hire me in the first place?
Yeah, was it like your coding experience or something?
That probably helped. They actually said they had a set of rigorous interviews where they kind of grilled me over the course of there's a professor there named James Troy as well, who's now at Yale, who also was working with
Oh yeah.
David, a group of those people together, Bridget Major as well. So like three of them, and they all kind of grilled me and like. But I was also coming from Chicago. Like I had good grades at Chicago. I had kind of proven myself through that. So I think the combination of the Chicago, transcript plus doing well in
Yeah.
those interviews plus the coding skills probably
Yeah,
helped
yeah,
them.
yeah. Right. Right.
So and also like let's be honest, I was not making very much money. So at the end of the
Yeah.
day, like, their ability to be super choosy is restricted by the pool of applicants that are willing to work for not as much money in
Right.
exchange for things things along
Yeah,
those
yeah, yeah.
lines.
Preference signaling and stuff like that. Right.
Exactly right. Exactly.
I mean, so that's interesting. So then with Leibson, something starts to make you think, Well, so you were like, I don't want to do the law thing, and you're doing this RA thing with Leibson, and so at some point you start thinking, I actually might want to do an economics PhD.
Yeah, yeah. By the time I was a few months into that job, I was pretty convinced I wanted to do an econ PhD for
Okay.
sure. And a big part of that was, that's when I really got, that's when I first really got exposed to what it was like to actually do economic research.
Yeah.
Because we would sit in these weekly meetings with David and James and Bridget, and we would like bounce ideas off of each other, and then
Mhm.
we as the RAs would go and run a bunch of regressions and come back next week and show a bunch of regression results, and then we would decompose those regression results and ask questions about them, and like then the conversation would evolve. So it
Mm.
was very real research, and I loved it, like the intellectual curiosity, the ability to then take a question that you don't know the answer to and go look at a bunch of data and
Yeah.
like start to actually learn how to use regression and econometrics to answer some of these questions, things along those lines.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff that you think a lot about in terms of like causal inference and sources of endogeneity, things along those lines, right? So it was sort of for me the full package of econ research, and I really liked it, and so
Mm.
that sold me on the idea of doing an econ PhD for
Mm.
sure. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. It's funny. I mean, it's weird the way that liberal arts background. I see so much of I see, it's funny, like economics and the liberal arts background and the coding and that creativity. They really go so well together, but it's like unless you're doing it, you don't know they go well together because like from a distance, it's not really as visible
Yeah.
to an observer that's what life is kind of like a little bit.
I think a big part of it for me is just this idea of intellectual curiosity,
Yeah.
being really interested and engaged. And I think that that's been a thread for me through my whole life, around all
Mm.
that sort of stuff. And so, intellectual curiosity drew me to, liberal arts education. Intellectual curiosity drew me to doing econ research,
Mm.
and to a certain extent, the programming and the tech stuff, because it's just intellectually really interesting once you get into the guts of like the tech stuff and how it works
Right.
and kind of programming things along those lines. So to me, there was a common thread among those
Yeah.
things. But I don't know if that's unique to me or there's actually other people who feel very similarly
Well, so
about
who
it.
did you end up working with at Harvard? Was it Leibson?
No, so I still stayed in touch with Leibson, but David was very much into the behavioral
Yeah.
world, right? That's his thing. That wasn't so much where I wanted to go with my
Did you
career.
think that was going to be what you were interested in?
I didn't know. I
Yeah.
didn't know. But what became very clearly apparent to me is I wasn't ready for any of the behavioral stuff,
Mm.
because I think it's really important to kind of get your grounding in like, economic theory. And here's how you think about economic theory before you then start layering in this other stuff on
Yeah.
top of it. And I think that's what David has done really well, right? Like that's why that I think that's what has set David apart is his ability to like live in both of these worlds, right? I think
Yeah.
so I knew that once I was working for David, I was like, this is really interesting. This is great stuff, but I need to go back and really fill in the gaps here before I
Yeah.
even engage in that. So I started grad school, and I was actually really interested in two different topics, very different topics. One was sort of political economics and kind of,
Mm.
so Marty Feldstein was at Harvard at the time. And so he was pretty big in public economics and things along those lines. And then the other was industrial organization, which do you want me to explain for people out there what that is? I don't
Yeah,
know.
that'd be great. Hmm.
Yeah, so industrial organization is a subfield of economics that thinks about how markets are organized and how firms interact within those markets. So a lot of things around monopoly and competition, kind of like how do firms compete with each other, and big firms, small firms. How do we think about firm size and innovation, things along those lines?
Hmm.
Does that sound accurate to you? You want to fill
Yeah.
any notes?
Yeah, that does sound accurate to me. Yeah. Uh, but you sort of move. I mean, in some ways, you really move kind of rapidly to the. I guess going to Harvard, you're going to move to the edge of IO. But like even in your research, this focus on platforms and the
Yep.
two-sided matching. It's were you already doing that at Harvard?
I was, by the time I was working on, like, say, my dissertation in my like third, fourth, fifth years, right? So I was already kind of, I had pretty firmly moved in that direction by that point. So
So yeah, like so were you in your so in your what was your dissertation on before I
yeah, my dissertation was about actually the CPU market, so Intel and AMD, and
oh
how they compete with each other, and sort of what's the relationship between the product lines that they offered and sort of innovation in the market overall, right? And so
oh
I was really pretty into tech even at that point when it came
right.
to our research, right?
Did you
Um,
notice that you were going to be was that something tech was just always in your head?
yeah,
Because even
I'm
going back to that time and after college.
exactly. And
Yeah.
so sort of always tech has always been a part of how I thought about the world. And like
Right.
if you give me 3 hours on the internet, I might spend 2 hours reading random tech blogs and things along
Right.
those.
Right. Right.
You know,
Right.
more so then than now. Now that I spend most of my time thinking about tech stuff on a daily
Mm-hmm.
basis, especially back then. So
Mm-hmm.
you know, as I found myself in grad school, and you really have to be, I mean, as you know, wow, like you have to be you have to be really fucking motivated by your research, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, especially as a grad student, when you're just dropped, you know, well, this is the way it worked at Harvard, I think it
Right.
still does. In your third year, it's just like, okay, congratulations, go write a dissertation, you
Right.
know? And so you have to be really engaged and really interested in the topic. And so I found myself gravitating to the things that were interesting to me, and that turned out to be tech, and a lot
Mm.
of technologies.
Mm-hmm.
I will say I also think that there's another element of this, which is, and I would love to talk about this, which is, you know, what was fascinating for me about going through grad school is all of these, like we were talking about classical liberal philosophy earlier and like perfect competition. And I always sort of the opposite of that, right? Like IO says, industrial organization says perfect competition doesn't apply most of the time. So
Right.
how does the world actually work? How do markets actually function? And to me, that was very appealing because it was much more consistent with my idea of how most markets actually function, and certainly more consistent with most of the markets that I was interested in. Right?
Mm.
You know, not most markets are not organized in a way like, you know, what's the classic example of wheat, right? Wheat number two wheat, right, for perfect competition, right? And that's just not the world that we engage with for the most
Right.
part. We go to the supermarket, you know, these are firms that are they're large firms, they're conglomerates, they're engaging with each other in ways that are not perfectly competitive. And so I
Yeah.
was drawn to that because to me it described the world in
Mm.
a better and more more realistic way, right?
Mm.
And so I wanted to say that, like, it's sort of, you start to go down this path, and for me, I went down this path in grad school, and especially with studying IO, where you start to say, well, yeah, but what are the assumptions that underlie like classical liberal theory, right? And then you start asking yourself more and more questions, and then you kind of end up in a very, for me, I ended up in a very different place, which is you have to recognize that there are real sort of challenges to markets functioning appropriately, or effectively, I should say, not appropriate,
Right.
effective. And
Right.
so then it gets really interesting because you start asking the questions of like, under what circumstances do markets you know, work well, and when do they not? And that to
Mm.
me is a really, really interesting topic area. So I got really into that, and kind of never have looked back, to be really honest. That's been
Yeah.
a common thread through things.
The did you when you were starting to think about like moving away from perfect competition but thinking purely in terms of like the tech application, was there certain kinds of ways that tech is imperfect that's not as obvious to somebody that doesn't like know it really well?
Well, you know what? The thing that was most interesting, I don't know if this is going to exactly answer your question or not, but I think is kind of where a lot of the action is sort of like the dynamics of these industries, right? So I'll
uh
give you an example. Like, take the market I was studying for my dissertation, which is CPUs, which is, you know, has two firms, Intel and AMD, right? You know,
mm,
for, you know, the type of market that I was looking at. So that's it. That's the whole market there, is two firms, right? Um, and so on the one hand, like first order, it's very hard to say like this is a super competitive market, right?
mm,
But on the other hand, you know, a lot of the data kind of shows you that it is functioning relatively well. It's a pretty interesting, perfectly, I mean, these firms are competing hard with each other, right? So then you
mm,
start asking yourself why, and you know what's going on. And then you start layering in sort of, it's not about static competition, it's about like the long run dynamics of competition between the two firms. And you start talking about things like innovation. How does a firm like Intel actually innovate, or a firm like AMD actually innovate? And how do they recoup their investment in these large, like innovation activities that they do, right? And to me, then, so I guess I'm not really answering your question, but I'm changing the question a little
Yeah.
bit to say, like, it's not, it's that the nature of imperfect competition is really super interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not just static, it's also dynamic, and then it's not
Right.
just about like how big is the firm, it's like, how substitutable are the products, right? Things along those lines, and then you start having to put together these models that have the appropriate level of complexity for the problem space that you're working in, and that's the art, I think, of working in IO, is and actually in tech, I would say, is how do you put together a model that appropriately captures the features you want to capture, but is not so complicated that you can no longer make any sense out of it, or
Yeah.
actually it in any way, shape, or form.
Well, so I mean, was there like a body of models that you found to be like really the most useful in
Yeah,
graduate
well, I
school
mean,
for thinking about this?
yeah, I mean, it was pretty preconceived that I was going to go down one path because I was at Harvard, and structural IO.
Ah,
Ariel Pekis turned out to be my main advisor, right?
oh,
Like,
okay.
I didn't
All right.
have a choice at Harvard, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
if you were gonna be an IO, you were gonna be a structural IO
yeah. Uh-huh.
guy,
Right.
or woman, and that's, but that I loved, right? Like, structural IO, I think, is a wonderful way of organizing thoughts and forcing clarity of thought on the problem that you're studying, right? Because you have to write it all down with math, right? You can't get away with sloppy logic. You're literally writing down your mathematical model of how you think firms are behaving, and you have to make very real trade-offs around how you put in complexity there. So
Okay.
structural
So let's say I took a IO economist from like the 80s,
yeah.
and you guys meet. He's like been in ice or whatever, like Captain America,
Yeah.
and then like he thaws him out, and you're like, he meets you and he's like, what's structural IO? What would he, how would you explain to him that it, in a way that he would understand what's similar and different about it
From like like
from
as an example,
anything that's like in the past of like
yeah, like
a on
John
that
Perot
continuum?
style, yeah, like IO, right? Yeah. No, I think the biggest difference comes with the idea that you're actually going to try and econometrically estimate the models that you're writing down, right? So let me explain why that's so important, because you have to work through your model to get something that you can actually estimate. And I
Mm-hmm.
think if you look back at the, like sort of 80s style IO, again, like the John Turrell's famous textbook, which we all kind of use, right? Like, there was no sense in which, there was an effort to take those models and literally estimate the primitives of the model, right? Like,
Right.
it was all kind of, like, hey, let's write down, an applied theory model of the world, and then let's test its implications, right? Which is a very different style of research or of an approach to the problem relative to the structural IO one that says, hey, let's actually write down the theoretical model and then try and estimate the actual parameters of the model in a way that's interpretable within the theoretical
I bet
framework,
that
right?
was really exciting.
It is. It's a very, very fun, exciting field, structural IO. It's also very technically complex because you're trying to estimate these pretty crazy models to a certain extent,
Yeah.
going in that direction as well. And you end up learning a lot about econometrics. I never thought I would go deep on econometrics, but it kind of, I'm not an econometrician by any stretch, but like, you end up down this path of needing to start to go in that direction. I love that.
What are the skills? What are the latent skills that, makes a person, well, what were the skills you didn't know that you had that in fact were really well rewarded by that?
Programming. I mean, it's going to
What
come
was
back
the
to
coding stuff?
coding. I mean, the coding stuff, you had to be pretty good coder to be able to
Because you're
work with.
picking up MATLAB. Is that what you're
Yeah,
working with?
MATLAB at the time it was all MATLAB. I think most places have moved to R and Python at this point. But yeah, back then it was
Oh,
all MATLAB. So yeah, I learned MATLAB, was pretty hardcore into MATLAB. MATLAB has these like C interfaces that become really interesting if you're trying to do
mm,
hardcore stuff. So I didn't know that I would need those skills, but They sure came in handy when you're working on some of these problems.
So then you
But,
graduate and you go back to Chicago as a faculty member.
it's a little more complicated than that. I actually took a 1 year postdoc, although we didn't call it that, at eBay from 2011 to 2012.
Oh,
When I applied for jobs, I was kind of like,
is that
just
when you met Steve Tadallis
yeah, Steve and I worked
and
together.
Blake? Okay, I know
Yeah, yeah,
that you're econometrica. Okay.
exactly. Yeah. We worked on that paper that year I was at eBay.
Uh-huh.
So so what happened was I applied broadly to a bunch of different places, as you want to do, right? When you're in the job market, you're pretty risk averse, things along those lines.
Hmm.
Um, and again, like I was always interested in tech. And you remember this was 2011. There were not a lot of tech economists at that point. There were very,
Yeah.
very few tech economists. So
This
when I
is the
saw,
beginning, right?
yeah,
It's
this is
like,
really
is that the case? I've been trying to figure it out. Like, I know Varian goes much earlier, but it seems like there's a second wave. Is that right?
I
Or
think
like
it's
the modern wave starts like 2010.
I think the if you looked at like just a graph of the number of economists, I think 2011 is when it starts to pick up, right?
Okay.
There were people in the there were economists in the tech industry. Yahoo Research Labs had a pretty reasonable sized group, and like I think there were people like Randall Lewis and Justin Rao who went a few years. That was like 2007, 2008, maybe
Mm,
2009. So there were a few folks that had really, I think, been the pioneers, especially because there were Hal and Susan, but Hal came very late in his career. I think what's different about this next set of wave of economists is people really coming after their PhD and moving into
right.
the tech, right?
Right.
And the actual shift that we started to see starting in 2009, 2010, and then picking up steam in 2011, right,
Mm.
was the actual path that takes a PhD economist into one of these tech firms. That didn't exist, I think, before 2008, 2009, right?
Why do you think it changed?
Um, I mean, I don't have the relevant context because I don't know what these firms were like in 2005, 2006,
Well, who
2007.
started this postdoc at eBay?
Yeah, there was a guy named Neil Sundaresan who led the eBay research labs, and
Ah,
he just one day thought to himself, well, I don't know about one day, but he was like, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool to have an economist around or a couple economists around?" And so, he talked to few of the who was involved then. This was like Laurent Inev was at Stanford, and some of you kind of started talking to these Stanford folks, of course, because that's the natural connection.
right.
John and Laurent and John were working at Stanford, and he kind of like pulled them into the orbit, and they said, okay, well, if you want to hire an economist, put in an ad on the Joe, right, and
Right.
which is what the job openings for economists. So we just went through that path, and I don't think Neil. Frankly, I think Neil is awesome. I don't think he had any idea what he was doing at the time, right? But he was being
Hmm.
advised by Laurent and John. So I think it was just a kernel of an interesting idea from that perspective. Now, to be really clear, eBay Research Labs, which is where I spent that year, ended up imploding 3 or 4 years later, right? So
What
these
happened?
research labs, well, just in general, these research labs, and the Yahoo Research Lab was the same way, right? Like the tech firms, very hard for a tech firm to support a research
Right.
lab, right? It's just
Yeah.
expensive and the
Right.
connection between output. So it hasn't really been a workable model. But I think what you were seeing in the early days is you saw a few of these companies experimenting with the idea of a research labs. And then what happens is people go and they do this stuff and they end up being pretty good at it, right? Like
Yeah.
the research labs per se, but at working with the companies and helping the companies, of which we could spend a whole half an hour talking about, what makes someone good at that or not. But
Yeah.
I think someone like Justin Rao, who I have a ton of respect for, I just think he was really good at that. He was in a research labs, but he was also really good at working with people. And then things start to build on top of
Well, there's
itself.
human capital in that, right? I mean, like
Exactly.
you like, why would you? And then you go back to academia. It's not really portable
That's right.
necessarily,
That's
right?
right.
It's not firm specific human capital. It's almost like sector specific.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and a lot of those skills are, I mean, some of those are like, actually, how do I, work with big data, things along those lines, which is not
Right.
what you're trying to do in grad school. Maybe more so now than it used to be, but that was not something we were doing in grad school. It's like, big data type stuff.
Yeah.
But that is also I like how you put that, the sector specific human capital around. how do I talk to somebody who's a project manager but not an economist?
Right.
And then they tell you you're an idiot. How do you respond to that?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah.
You have to learn that. And so I think the narrative that I would tell is that people started moving into this space and building that human capital, and then it was sort of an adjacent thing to move from a research lab into like actually working in tech in an actual
You
position,
know,
right?
it actually reminds me more almost in some way of development economics, because like in development, it seems like it's all about building alliances and working with these different stakeholders and like,
Right.
talking to these people that are going to do this and then moving over here. It's like
Yeah,
much more like many social relationships and like successful being successful at completing it. And it seems like there's almost like, I mean, it seems like tech actually it's like rewards non-cognitive skill, like social skills almost.
yeah. I don't think. I mean, I hope that's not a shock to anybody that in order to succeed in the corporate world, you
I
sort
mean,
of
I
have
guess
to.
it's not, but it's like, you don't really think
Right.
economists don't have that reputation of
Mhm.
like, oh, my skill at like getting along is really gonna, like that economists don't usually have the reputation of having a skill of getting along.
Yeah. And to be really fair, I think the tech umbrella of economists at this point is
Mm-hmm.
pretty broad. And so
Mm-hmm.
you can be hardcore nerd in your back corner, not talking to anybody, and there's probably a niche for you in tech, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not the path that we were working on back in 2011, 2010,
Mm.
2012, when I think we really just econ had to be established. In order to establish it, you had to be able to, work with stakeholders and show value to those stakeholders,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it
Gosh, I
wouldn't
mean, did you kind of wonder to yourself, wait a second, I'm about to go to Chicago, but it's kind of, I'm leaving something.
Totally, 100%. That's a big part of it. I loved my year at eBay. It was wonderful. It was fun. It was fast paced. I learned a ton. I
Hmm.
thought it was fun to work with people. I love different perspectives. It was just a totally different thing than I had ever really been exposed to. And so when I went back to Chicago, it was a very jarring experience for me to go from a job that was like super engaged and super, I was meeting with people every day, talking to them, bouncing ideas off of each other, to, the academic world, which,
Right.
it's just a very different environment. And so it
Mhm.
was like, I remember showing up to booth and like having my office, and it was the summer, it was like August or something along those lines. I walked in my office and like there was a printer and a box of paper. That was the only thing that was there, right? And there was no one around because it was August, of course. There
Yeah.
was no one in the whole building.
Right.
So I was leaving an environment that was really engaging. Now, of course, I also liked my experience at Booth, but it became very clear to me when I was at Booth and doing the assistant professor thing that from a just life satisfaction perspective, like I was going to be much happier in tech than I was
Mm.
in the academic
So
world,
wait,
right?
so what's been your path in tech? Because like I know, so you were at eBay,
Yeah.
you leave Booth. Where have you gone?
So then I was at Booth for a few years, and decided with my now wife Erin, who was in Chicago, that we wanted to move to the. But another thing I would love to like
Yeah.
just say,
Uh-huh.
just in terms of like as we're having this conversation, that I learned is that somehow economists convince themselves that location does not matter and you should take the best job you possibly can.
Right.
I've learned for myself, location is really fucking important, right?
Yeah,
Like
sure. Yeah.
it's really different to live in, Chicago relative to the West Coast. And for
Uh-huh.
me, I kind of had learned again with
I heard the winters are really nice though in Chicago.
yeah,
Is that not
yeah.
right?
That's
Did I hear the wrong? Is that a rumor? Is
Chicago
that not
winters,
correct?
Boston winters. Yes, there's a lot of fun. So, um, yeah. So I think there were two
There was a
things that
lot of amenities that
yeah,
you had experienced at
yeah,
eBay.
exactly. Yeah, I was in California. I loved California. I was in Washington and Seattle
Yeah.
are places that I knew as well. So my wife and I just kind of like thought about what I wanted out of my life when I was in,
Mm,
and kind of like recognizing that I don't love this, right? Like I'm not waking up like really super jazzed. I liked my research, but I then had this experience at eBay that kind of showed me that there was something else out there in a deep way. and that made me kind of pushed me over.
But Chris, like when you would have done this, when you would have switched out, see, I feel like right now students can look at tech and they can be like, well, there's this whole continuum now of like kind of the junior level to a really high senior level. And it's like in your brain, it's molded that there's like a big distribution of compensation. There's like all these different ways to sort. But what did it seem like to you then? Because you wouldn't have had as much mass in the
It,
distribution, right?
yeah,
Of role models or what might be a career.
yeah, it was wasn't quite as drastic as you're making it sound, and I'll explain.
Okay.
But because this was 2014, 2015, by that time, like I said, things had started picking up a little bit. And in particular, to give away the story, at Amazon, things had been, so Pat Beyer, he had been the chief economist at Amazon. I knew Pat from the academic circles. And then someone who's become a good friend of mine, Phil Leslie, also who was at Stanford, had gone to Amazon at that point as well. So there was a few folks there that I trusted, that I could talk to around what it was like to be at Amazon at the time.
Yeah.
And you're right that there wasn't this continuum. What existed at Amazon at the time was a few very senior people, which at that point I believe was just Pat and Phil, and then a bunch of junior people that they had hired, right? And so what I was doing was kind of slotting in between, and there was risk associated with that, right? It was not that common for someone to move at that point in their career. And so there really was some real palatable risk there. Now I hedged that risk by going on leave from Booth for a year to give myself a chance to try. So I always had that safety net. I could go back to Booth.
Right.
I felt the risk for sure, moving out to Seattle with Aaron and like starting a new life without some firm conception of what that would look like in the future.
Yeah.
For me, I feel like those are the chances you have to take, in order to like really start to flesh out what your life can actually look like. And if you don't, then you miss out on opportunities. So,
I mean, it's our life, these are our lives, not
exactly.
our advisors' lives, or I mean, this is the one life we get to do something really that is meaningful, and that's all subjective. Heck, that's economics there. It's all subjective preferences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what the next step was, I started working at Amazon, and worked there. I worked at Amazon for 4 years, and then became sort of moved from just being like an independent individual contributor to like managing a team, et cetera, and like a transition. And then I moved to Uber, which we could talk about if you'd like.
Well, so how long were you at Amazon?
4 years.
4 years, and so that would have been what, like 2019 or something?
2015. I think 2015 to 2019 was right.
And so you've been at Uber since then. So you had one move. You went from Amazon to Uber.
Correct. Yeah.
What were you hired at Uber to do? Like, what was your title originally?
I was a director of applied science. So
director of applied science. I don't even know how any of this work. What this
I know, right? Yeah.
Like, I only know academic units. So like, what is it exactly?
It's a totally opaque system of just like the academic one is opaque to everybody except for people in the academic world.
Yeah.
There's a whole tech opaque culture around different levels and different job titles and things along those lines. So you specifically asked me about like my job title, I guess, or what my job. It's I gave you my title, but yeah, that's pretty meaningless.
Okay.
Anyways, yeah, what I was hired to do was work on the science components of the earner side of the Uber marketplace. So everything having to do with drivers and couriers, right? Like, which has all kinds of like super interesting economic problems embedded in it, right? Because you think about like labor supply problems and questions combined with, what we were talking about a little bit earlier, at least this is marketplace design, right? Things along those lines.
Yeah.
So I started out doing that, and my career progressed at Uber to the point where now I'm leading a much bigger chunk of the Uber science infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
So what really attracted me to Uber, not that you asked this question, but I'll answer it anyway, is two things. One is I love this idea of working on and for earners, right? I think the earner component of the Uber platform is really powerful and is really an enabler in a deep way, right? You can download the Uber app, pass a background check, and earn money, right? And to me, that was very, very powerful and a very motivating force, was to work in that area to try and understand how things worked and what was working well and what wasn't working well.
Mhm.
And then the second thing that was really exciting to me intellectually was just this marketplace design
I
question,
bet.
right?
Yeah.
No other company in the world, I won't say none, very few other companies in the world that are so dependent and so have such an interesting marketplace.
Yeah.
Um, so between the two of those things, there aren't too many companies that are better to work at for if you're interested in the sorts of things that I'm interested in than
So what's your day job like? What are you doing when you wake up and all throughout the day?
I sit in a lot of meetings, Scott. I sit in a lot of meetings,
Yeah.
So, as what you realize is as your team becomes bigger, you end up just filling your time with meetings. And so I have to consciously work to clear calendar time to not be in meetings and read docs, things along those lines. So the way I think about it now is most of my day job is really around, vetting the work that my team is doing and communicating that out to, senior leaders at Uber, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in some ways, I kind of think of myself more like, when you're a junior professor, assistant professor, you're doing all the work yourself, right? When you're a senior professor, you kind of are advising grad students a lot more. And on the projects that you're working on, you probably have research assistants that are grad students, things along those lines. And
Mm-hmm.
so my day job is much more in that latter camp right now. It's like, helping my team, reviewing their work, moving them in different directions, things along those lines. So,
I mean, that doesn't seem like, I guess, do you think that there's a counterpart to you in academia that's like the lab, the guy that runs the lab, or is there like some counterpart to this that would make sense to academics?
oh, I think like if you look, so set aside economics for a second, but like think about the academic world more generally and like sort of these models of science, right? Like,
Yeah.
chemistry, where you have your chemistry lab and you have your grad students, you have your postdocs, and you have the leader of the lab, right? In essence. Um, I think that is actually not so different from what it's like to do science in a tech company, right?
Mm.
Now, there are lots of other similarities and differences, but at the end of the day, I'll bet if you asked one of those folks, like, what's your day job, it would probably sound a lot like mine, which is you meet with a lot of people, you review a lot of research, you write stuff up, you do presentations, right?
Yeah.
On those lines, and you're presenting stuff that isn't always things that you worked on directly, but you worked on indirectly through the people that are working in your lab.
Something you just said, actually, doing science in tech. I definitely don't think that some body, I think there's a lot of people out there, they would not have known that that is what the Economist is being hired to do, science in the tech.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a misconception that a lot of people have in the academic world, at least. I don't know how this extends outside of the academic world,
Yeah.
that like, we're like slaves to the machine in the tech. And, like I think we're doing very real science. And in many ways, I think we're actually doing probably more sophisticated and better science in the academic world
Mm-hmm.
because we have access to more data.
Yeah,
You know,
right, right.
more
And
data.
and more correct institutional details, it seems like.
Exactly, exactly. Institutional details, data, and the ability to run experiments
Yeah.
means I think we do some pretty sophisticated and good science. And
Though, Chris, like, here's the thing is though, like I'm teaching this history of economic thought class, and it's like it's really kind of interesting because of how Malthus or Smith, or it would be like Smith and then it would be Malthus and Ricardo, you know, they can only interact with each other because they published.
right.
And it seems like the thing is in tech is like you guys are generating all of this knowledge, but it's all like, is it gonna get carried forward, like, or does it all just get siloed and doesn't become general knowledge?
Yeah. There's a lot of knowledge sharing that goes on indirectly within the tech industry. And a
Mm.
lot, I think this is a well-worn like subject in terms of Silicon Valley, but a lot of that flows through people moving from one firm to another, right?
Yeah, right.
And we do have our own conferences where we talk about this sort of stuff. So I think there's a lot of knowledge within tech, around how to do things and how to think about economics within the tech world, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think you're raising a really good point, though. Does that ever get exported out of the tech world? And
Mm-hmm.
that bridge just hasn't been built right now, which is unfortunate. And I think it's, to just be really fair, I think it's on both sides, right? Like I think
Mm.
people who work in tech have obviously been reluctant to publish on a lot of things for two reasons. One is, just like competitive knowledge, and then the
Yeah.
second is time, right?
I
Like
was just
taking,
about to say,
like when am I supposed to write a paper,
when are you
right?
going to
Like,
write it?
yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly. I mean, it's not in the incentives either
right, right, and we're
of the firm
right,
necessarily. Like, what do they gain from it?
yeah. But I will say this, a place like Uber, more so than Amazon, is very willing to go down the path of considering publishing. And actually, a bunch of research has come out of Uber, with my
Yeah.
friend Jonathan Hall, and his group has written a bunch of papers. So it's not like this is not an insurmountable battle. Like it's possible that we would publish this sort of stuff. So this is why I say it's also on the other side, which is what would be the reception of something like that? Because the thing I really wouldn't want to do is spend a lot of time on a paper and then just have it be shat on in the
Yeah.
academic world, right?
Right.
So it's kind of like that delicate balance of saying like, yes, I would love to write really good papers that kind of share knowledge, but what I don't really want to do is go down the path of spending a bunch of time and energy writing a paper that then ends up being like not really that interesting to the academic
Yeah.
world. So
But it's funny though, because like, it's like part of the scientific production function, it seems like is publishing.
yeah,
Because as opposed to just like I don't always think when you're a kid, you're taking science classes and stuff, and you just it's very it's like individual, but like the publishing part is what allows it to become a social
yeah,
thing. And it's funny. I mean it has happened, like uh at Guinness, Gossett published
yeah,
anonymously,
yeah,
so like there's definitely, I know that there is but that's the whole thing, right? It's like that was a crucial discovery,
yeah.
but it was from publishing. And I guess I just wonder, like, I guess it's like I kind of do have a lot of confidence that stuff does tend to get out that is important, and that humans sort of solve these things collectively. I just always wonder to myself, like, are you guys over there proving something that's like really socially critical that doesn't get out?
Yeah. Um, it's a good it's a good point. I would say the challenge is that most of the time the answer is probably no, right?
Uh-huh.
There may be that 5 or 10% of things that we're doing that should get out and would be really interesting to get out, right? But as you know very well, it's very challenging to figure out what that 5 or 10%
Well, you
actually
think
is.
about your econometrica though.
Yeah, I
Like,
didn't think
that's like the amount of, I guess I might be teaching it wrong, but like I always think, how much money is being wasted hypothetically when the return on investment on search engine marketing from, correlational analysis is between 1,600 and 4,000%.
yeah,
And then you run a randomized control trial and it's between -3 and -150%. It
yeah,
seems like that's a tremendously important discovery about what might be a potentially wasteful use of humans' scarce resources.
yeah.
But like
Well, here's
eBay could have easily said, nah,
yeah.
we're not doing it.
Here's the thing, Scott, and Steve will probably not love me like going down this path, but like I'm not actually sure how much impact that paper has in practice. I think it's been tremendously successful within the academic world, and academics love to talk about it from the perspective of like, hey, look at this that shows that industry is quote unquote like doing something stupid. But the reality is, if you look at how most firms are actually making paid search decisions, they're still doing the same thing that eBay was. In fact, it's a constant discussion that I have with people in terms of like, hey, how do you actually do this better? And so I would challenge, like, I'm glad that paper got published.
Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised at the reception that got, to be really honest. And, obviously has a very strong positive reception. I didn't expect it to be that strong and positive. But I'm not sure that we've seen the feedback loop actually come back and change the industry in any really meaningful ways.
Yeah, sure. But that's the thing, is like a lot of that stuff seems long run though,
Yeah,
like Jon Snow died and nobody believed any of the crap he had got these beautiful pictures and this incredibly well crafted argument. It's like, the rhetoric of his book in
Sure.
is incredible, and he dies.
Yeah.
And they only believe him 15 years later when they have another cholera outbreak, and it's in an area where they hadn't moved the pipes yet. And it's like, and Emily Dickinson, her poems were never published in her lifetime. And it's like, it just seems like, some of this stuff is just a part of starts to become the fabric of knowledge, and it's like, I just can't imagine that, some kid who's learning about advertising for the first time, reads your paper and it just doesn't have an effect
Yeah.
in the long run.
I like how you put that, though. I think it kind of points to a much broader need here, which I like what you said about like a fabric of knowledge, right? To a certain extent, and I think maybe it's more about, and I'm glad I'm kind of thinking this out loud on the spot. It's more less about any individual paper, and it's more about the general exporting of the fabric of knowledge that I think we like. And so, I'll give you one very specific example, which is I think we know a lot more about demand curves within firms than we do outside of firms at this point, right? And like you think about like the traditional way of like estimating demand curves, like with like BLP, if that means anything to your listeners. And like we've just come a long way and especially within tech, where it's critical to understand what demand curves look like, right? So that's an area where is that like a really good paper? I don't know, but there's certainly a fabric of knowledge there about what we could do and what we've learned from demand systems that's not in the academic world that I think probably should be there. But again, it's really hard to figure out how do you package that together and have the conversation in a way that moves knowledge forward. And the thing I would say about that is, very well, Scott, like it's not like the publishing process is some like super clean, amazing,
totally.
it's a kind of a shit show, right?
Yeah. It's filled with lots of stuff.
So you kind of like you work backward from the idea that the whole process is dirty, in my opinion. Has all this complexity and all these traps associated with it. You're like, okay, well, how do we actually bridge those things? I think if there were a desire on both sides to make this happen, I think it could, and it would be fascinating because the sorts of stuff that I think we learn are just intellectually really, really interesting. So.
Well, I have other questions, but I feel like I've talked. I just want to. I guess I am debating about this. Just could take a long time, but like I guess I'm just going to ask real quick. So, we have similar interests. I was surprised that I've interested in similar things. So I have this background, though it's very on the surface it's really different. So like I have this interest in the illicit markets, and particularly internet mediated sex work. That's what my whole career's been about until just really recently. And so I found a website that where clients would review sex workers back in 2007, and I had never heard anything like that. And so, I just spent a long time on it. But my ability to study it was really limited to being able to scrape the website, and so there was like, it's really, scraping is so kind of like such a double-edged sword, because you're like, oh my gosh, I have all this. And then you're like, you can't seem to like do more. You can't, especially with a website like the Erotic Review, like they won't answer your emails. So like, I can't even get questions answered. So, but you've written about it. And it's like, so this thing I was wanting to talk about is like the Erotic Review has reviews, clients review sex workers. The Silk Road was a platform on Tor, and it was really innovative, buy drugs, and there was sellers. They had an escrow account, early adopter of Bitcoin, and they used reviews too. But so like superficially, I think a lot of people are like, oh, the reviews are enforcing contracts that are otherwise not enforceable because these are illegal markets and you can't like sue somebody for selling you drugs that is not real or whatever. But you've kind of written at a deeper level about reputation, and because you've got this paper, this 2015 working paper with Steve Tadelis, and I just was kind of curious, like, first of all, what role, big picture, is reputation playing in economic activity from from you being a professional economist that studies for a long time, and why is it that online reviews are not functioning well as reputation mechanisms in general?
Yeah. I think you have to decompose the problem into two different pieces when you think about most of this, right? One is, do reputation systems work well enough to, make a market work that wouldn't work otherwise? And the answer is probably yes, right? I think the reputation systems have enough bite to them that there are whole markets that might not exist were it not for reputation systems. I think eBay is the classic example of that. In fact, eBay is often used as an example of a market that couldn't exist without reviews.
Why am I not needing reputations when I go buy milk at the grocery store? I don't know anything about it. I don't know anything about these farmers.
Oh, I think it's two things. It's brand, and it's the fact that the supermarket is vetting for you and they have
They're doing it already. Okay,
yeah.
so it's all baked in. Reputation is kind of baked in
into the firm that you go to, right? Like you wouldn't, if you went to a supermarket and they sold you rotten milk, you wouldn't go back to that supermarket.
You wouldn't go back to it. So okay, got it. So it actually is happening all the time. Totally. I don't know it's happening because of why. So why is it that it's like more visible than in eBay and all these other places?
Because the sellers are anonymous. So
okay,
the sellers are anonymous in that case. You need a dynamic system of something like reviews to flesh out that, what a brand does for a supermarket or what your experience with that particular supermarket does, right? Yeah. And said differently, like you're going to go back to that same supermarket over and over again. So you're going to learn about the quote unquote reputation without like a review. You probably never looked at a review of your local Safeway because you don't need to, because you went to the Safeway, you learned your, right? But in a market like eBay, you're interacting, or Amazon or any of these other, or Uber, right? You're interacting with a bunch of anonymous actors, and you might never interact with that person again. Right? Yeah. So you need the dynamic linkage of something like a review system to jumpstart something like an eBay system relative to like our traditional economic activity where you're dealing with known players. So I do think, like, going back to like this decomposition into two parts, the first part is kind of saying like, hey, eBay probably couldn't have existed without a review system, right? I don't think it probably wouldn't, and I think that's true. And I think when people have stated it, I don't know, like there's no empirical evidence one way or the other, but it's pretty good intuition that that's true. But then I think the second thing, which is where the paper with Steve kind of floats in this area, is they probably work less well than you think they do, and it's sort of discipline bad actors, I think, pretty quickly. And, are able to like weed out like some of the really bad stuff pretty quickly. But when it comes to distinguishing between, say, the 25th percentile and the 99th percentile of things, I don't think reputation or review systems actually help you as much as people might think that they would, right? And so sort of that gets into this question of like what the paper is getting at, which is you have to think carefully about the incentives that you set up within the reputation mechanism to try and create as much quote unquote good data as possible. And frankly, I just don't think most firms have done that well. And I think a good example of this is go to Amazon and like look at all their third-party sellers, and you're like spend an hour sorting through things. Is it cheap cheap, like, imported stuff that isn't blah, 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 right? It's pretty much a pretty big, hard process to go through a lot of that sort of stuff. So no, I think it's like, the promise of helping markets works pretty well, and that's probably true in the case of your sex workers example as well. I would posit a guess, right? Like probably pretty hard to distinguish between the 25th percentile and the 99th percentile, but you're probably going to get rid of the 0 to 25th percentile. And I make
it's like you get all these weird things that people don't really. I mean, I think you get a lot with voluntary reviews. You get a lot of things that are not obviously revealing a lot of information. Like you get a lot of people that write a lot of reviews, like most of the reviews will come from a small number of people, but you're not really sure if that means most of the economic activity is coming from those people. because there's all this like selection, all these weird selection things. And so you're not really positive, it's like when you're observing it, you're just not really sure what you're observing,
Exactly.
always
Exactly.
anyway.
I think if you start to think about what you do as a consumer, you actually, if you're engaging on any of these websites that have a lot of sort of reliance on reviews, you're spending a tremendous amount of mental energy to undo the sort of stuff that you're talking about, right? Not exactly the like, but like you kind of understand that there's a certain bias. Some of these reviews may be fake, right? Like, oh, does this seller only has one review versus 10 reviews? How do I balance those? And so you end up with a pretty rich set of heuristics around decisions.
Yeah.
And sometimes then you still get stuff you don't want,
Right.
And so I think if you really think about it, it's a failure of online review systems that the heuristics have to be so complicated to process through the information that ends up being created by these reputation mechanisms. So that's, I
Is
guess,
this a pretty active area within tech, like the just studying reviews and review mechanisms and things like that?
less so than you would think. Not really. So most firms, and I can say this like, with my experience at a few different firms, usually kind of have this mentality of like set it up and forget about it, right?
Set it up and get it right. Maybe at the margin, maybe the gains aren't huge at the margin to get it right.
Exactly. And as long as people are willing to do that heuristic work that I was talking about, then by most of the metrics from a tech perspective, what's the value of improving these things, right?
Yeah.
Other people doing the work, right? So I do think I haven't seen a ton of like really active work within tech on this. I think there should be, frankly, and I hope that we end up evolving and making better systems.
Yeah.
Because I don't love the like sort of steady state that we're in right now.
Yeah.
Overall.
Well, so okay, I'm going to end with this. So I was just kind of curious, the thing is like, you don't know what you don't know. That's kind of like always, it's like, so you don't know what you don't know. And there's all these people that don't know what it's like being a tech economist. They don't even know the categories to even ask questions like what it's like. So I was curious, like, just in your own short, brief kind of conclusion of this, like, what do you think is what has been for you the salient information that you think this really is something that is competitive, that's not obvious to, it's not obvious to other people, it's competitive, and whatever it is that you love about being an economist, it's actually there?
Yeah, great question. I think the simple answer from my perspective is you are rewarded in tech for being intellectually curious and coming up with ideas that the firm has not thought about before. In other words, you're rewarded in tech for doing a lot of the same things that you are rewarded for in the academic world. It's just the process by which you get there is very different because you collaborate, you work with people in a very different way from the academic world. And so the number one, like if I could dispel a myth about working in tech, it's this idea that, hey, you move to tech and now all of a sudden the firm, whatever that may be, is telling you what problems to work on, right? That is not true to a certain extent, right? Like you are rewarded for coming up with new ideas, not for working on things that people already have been working on in the past, right? They don't need PhD economists to come in and do something that a product manager could do, right? They need PhD economists to come in and say like, hey, we're thinking about this problem in the wrong way. You should think about your marketplace design or your review system totally different than you are right now.
Yeah.
So I think people don't understand that. And I've had this conversation so many times with econ PhDs where they're like, well, I don't want to lose my flexibility in what I work on or things along those lines. And I think that's just the wrong approach because ultimately I'm much happier, being able to contribute to changing the way, we think about problems at Uber, and that's what I'm rewarded for, right? So it lines up much more closely than people actually think. And I just think it's just a common myth out there that like, people are telling us what to do. We don't have any choice or agency.
Right. Awesome. Well, it seems like watching the things that you've gotten to work on, just kind of, just from even reading your working papers and your publications, it's been really cool. Well, I really appreciate getting to talk. This has been really fun. It's really nice to meet you finally and get a chance to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Appreciate you having me on.